Now that we've looked at Orwell's life and works and some of his reasons as to why he became a writer, like as in his essay that we looked at in a previous video, Why I Write, around this time that he produces the essay Why I Write, he also produces another essay. He's very prolific in the art of essay writing. He produces an essay, Politics in the English Language, so in 1946. And this essay is arguably one of George Orwell's most famous essays. It is often read in undergrad classes, perhaps not as much today as it was in the olden days when I was an undergrad. I read it in an English course, and it was often read in humanities courses in general. It's fallen a little bit out of favor, but I think it still merits reading because Orwell's voice, like a great author's voice, still speaks to us across the years. So, but before we dig into that, just a wee bit more on his history. Um, Orwell went to a boarding school. I talked a little bit about his education, but just a little bit more. He went to a place called St. Cyprian's, which was a boarding school of the day. So the boys would, when it was a boys' school, there were girls' boarding schools as well. And so Orwell was there, and he wrote about it in rather ironically or a bitter title. Such were the joys. It was anything but a joy. Um, he said it was basically consisted of several unpleasant years, of which he talks about being beaten regularly and often humiliated. It was a rough and a dreary place. You were often embarrassed by schoolmasters, and the behavior he describes is quite despicable. But simply put, it's just bullying and incredible amounts of it. Especially for the newcomers, and as you rose up in the ranks, that is, in the years, you bullied the newcomers. So it was at least according to Orwell's imagery, an absolutely dreadful place. He expresses his disdain for the rote memorization that occurred in his education of the time. That basically, for example, he uses how they taught history. That the headmaster or the teacher would simply shout out a date, right? And then all the boys would sit in the class, and as the teacher would shout a date out, the boy who could quickly shout back what was the who was the quickest, that is, who could shout back what happened on that date that the teacher shouted out would be, given a little pat on the head, and the other boys would basically be chastised. So history was really just, a game of who could spout the fastest, who could react the quickest to the teacher when they just rattled off dates. And Orwell thought this was horrible. He said basically all we did is we were crammed. He uses the expression crammed with learning, and then he says rhetorically afterwards, like, what learning? Really, all we did was we just had a bunch of dates and events on those dates, and so in ordinary conversation you were encouraged to slip those things in, right? Oh well, this reminds me of, and then you'd rattle off a date and an event. And for Orwell, he's like, what learning really is that? All that does is he says, we were just trained to look smart, right? That was the whole idea of education, was to make you appear smart. And he singles out the headmaster's wife, Mrs. Wilkes, as essentially being, one who pushed this kind of education, who often humiliated him and, basically made fun of the children. And Orwell points out that the same thing goes for all of their, like, that was just an example of history, but they studied Latin and Greek and all kinds of ancient languages. But Orwell says it wasn't really the case that we would read and study a whole book of let's say, Cicero or Thucydides. No, we would just read snippets of it so that we would know how to, translate a little passage, and so that we would be prepared for certain kinds of exams where you would have to translate passages. But you didn't sit down and actually read the whole book and get a real fundamental understanding of what the author was all about. So again, same thing. It was all done for flash, rote memorization. It just made you look really smart. It was just the old-fashioned drill, rote education. It was drill. It wasn't trying to teach you to be wise or make decisions or whatnot. You just basically kind kind of like a data bank approach to education. Orwell mentions that this headmaster's wife, and that she, as I mentioned, she was rough on him, and but just also, yeah, I just wanted to pick up on her a little bit because she was very fond of English, and one of the ways that she taught English that other former students of hers have in their memoirs have recollected, it shows up in Orwell's work. That is, she liked to take passages in English literature and would stress the value of simple writing, straightforward prose, good, clear, solid prose. That was the way English should be written, nice and clear. And that's became something that we'll see very important to Orwell, was the straightforward style. So he was always trying to, emphasize that people should tone down the use of Latin phrases and all these other kinds of, and fancy metaphors. Unless you really knew what you were doing, you should always write in a straightforward English style. Now, Orwell also, in a couple other essays before we get to politics in the English language, Orwell mentions in the 1940 essay, Charles Dickens, he stresses that the writer has to be an independent figure. And that when, at the end of this essay on Charles Dickens, he says, one thing that comes out very clearly is the face of the writer. And not necessarily like the literal face, but the face of the writer as an independent thinker, somebody that's, taking a stand, making a case for something. So independence of thought was crucial in Orwell's mind. And you can't really be a good writer unless you're an independent thinker. And if you recall in Why I Write, you have to maintain your ability to look at your own bias and implicit bias in order to maintain your intellectual integrity. And the last point I want to point out, the last thing I want to mention is the 1944 essay, which was on Salvador Dali. Or there were a couple of biographies of Dali published in the 40s, and Orwell's review of a biography was called Benefit of Clergy, Some Notes on Salvador Dali. Rather strange title. You have to read the essay to get a good idea why he chose that. But Orwell is saying in Benefit of Clergy, what he means by that is that, clergy at the time, kind of got away with stuff that they shouldn't. They were clergy, so they got to do all kinds of things. And Orwell was reacting against this. And he said, we shouldn't think of artists as being a kind of clergy. Just because someone's a great artist, they don't get to say and do whatever they want. Now, in our society today, clearly that is a strong issue. And how we're just saying, no, if you're a great artist, you certainly don't get a pass on doing things. This is Orwell's point, is you don't get a pass. And but he does something that would be controversial today as well. Is, as usual, Orwell kind of speaks to us in a way where we can identify with what he's saying, but also he doesn't speak to us as if he's totally part of our time. And why do I say that? Well, it goes like this. He says that we have to, as independent thinkers and as critically minded thinkers, we have to be able to hold, for instance, two different thoughts in our head simultaneously. That is, he said, there's no question that Salvador Dali, is a great artist. He was a great painter. He was a great draftsman. He was incredibly talented, incredibly creative. But he also says there's no doubt that he's a disgusting human being, right? And this is the whole thing of Orwell, is that artists and everybody is involved in politics. Like it or not, we're all involved. But, Orwell says, yeah, you can be extremely talented. And he gives the example, if Shakespeare came back, we wouldn't let Shakespeare indulge in, and I'm not even going to repeat what Orwell says. You can read it. It's pretty rough. But he says something like this. If Shakespeare came back, we wouldn't allow him to indulge in terrible vices just because we thought, well, he might produce another King Lear or another Hamlet or something like that. No, artists are held in the same way that anybody else is to moral standards. But that doesn't mean that you go out and censor them. right? So Orwell wants a kind of balance. He says it's easy to run and censor everything, or and because you're afraid of what the artist would say, and it's easy to run and say no, don't censor anything. We're above all that. Let the artists do whatever they want. He said those extremes, those are easy positions, and when you think about it, it usually is more. It's a clearer position to take. You either censor or you don't at all, and you regard the artist as totally independent. Orwell thinks that's too easy and wants to go in between those.